You know, asked to be teaming up with Oz Guinness. It's like asking me if I'd like to play doubles with Roger Federer as my partner. And the wonderful thing about having Roger Federer as your partner is if you win, you can always say, we won. And if you lose, you can say Roger was not having a very good day that day. I was having lunch with Oz yesterday, and after I got into my car, I had to chuckle that we both have a lot of snow on the roof. And with the global warming that's going on, even that is diminishing right now. But that's where our resemblance ends. And I feel sort of inversely capable of dealing with this subject. In fact, when I was told what the subject matter was and to team up with Oz, I said, you know, Oz can do this all by himself or get somebody else. But strangely, they did not give me the freedom to say no. So here I am. And I have to deal with this right now. I'm just warming up my vocal cords here because I've been traveling so much, and about a few weeks ago, I completely lost my voice, totally. Could not whisper, could not even clear my throat. It's barely coming back now, and I hope within a few weeks it will be back to normal. But just to speak for a few moments at least gets it lubricated or warmed up a bit, so thank you for allowing me that privilege. In talking about this whole subject matter of freedom, I will approach it sort of linking it to what Oz has already said. The irony of the fact that so many universities have this as their motto, that if the truth shall set you free, you shall be free indeed. I know University of Texas is one of them. I think Johns Hopkins is another. I remember being at one of those universities and asking students if they knew what preceded that statement. And I didn't get a single person who answered that. Some even didn't know it had come from the scriptures. What it really says is, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples, then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So it was really not truth hanging with its feet planted firmly in midair. It was the truth that had already been revealed propositionally, and on that basis, the incarnation and so on, as Pilate stood in front of Jesus and said, what is truth? And never waited for the answer. I want to give you a picture in the beginning here as I go to what I really want to address, and it is this. If you look at a nation like ours, every now and then you will hear some politician utter this statement: we are a nation of laws. It's true, but almost every nation would say that. The question is, whose laws and what laws are we really talking about? But if you were to talk to an average person, the idea that we are a nation of laws and due process and all is enshrined in our rights. The fact is, we look at the laws as the roots in the structure. The trunk of the tree then becomes the political structure with which we function. The laws provide the political structure, and then the branches become the outworking within culture of how those laws are being implemented and either giving us liberty or constraints. So the roots are the laws, the trunk is the political system, and the branches become the culture and our expression. But I have a question on that every time I think about it, and that is this. What holds the roots together? What is it that keeps the roots intact? And the fascinating thing is that nobody really thinks of an answer to that question. The roots can only be held if something solid is gripping those roots. And I believe it was Chesterton who said, nothing good comes out of mere or pure reason, nor out of pure art. There has to be a moral sense that underlies both art and reasoning. And in the last few days, maybe if I give you the exact words and the way he said it, you'll see how beautifully he says it. Nothing sublimely artistic has ever arisen out of mere art, any more than anything essentially reasonable has ever arisen out of pure reason. There must always be a rich moral soil for any great aesthetic growth. That rich moral soil that holds the laws together that then grows into the trunk and the political structure and outwardly into the outworkings within our framework. That's what I want to talk about a little tonight. What is that moral soil? How do we find it? In the last few days and actually weeks, I've been reading a couple of books. One is Gertrude Himmelfarb's book, which is called Roads to Modernity. That was written somewhere around 2004, the great historian who's written so much on this subject. But then if you go back about 40 years, Russell Kirk penned that massive volume called Roots of American Order. Ironically, 40 years apart, they are both really saying the same thing, but coming at it from different angles. What Gertrude Himmelfarb actually does is go back to the framers, the writers, and the critics of the early days and points out something very critical in the three different enlightenments: the French Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment, and the American Enlightenment. The French, unfortunately, sort of the term Enlightenment always seems to be just coupled with their thinkers. But the fact of the matter is there was an Enlightenment in England, there was an Enlightenment in the United States, and she goes to great trouble to point out what the difference really is. I'm going to put a series of quotations together from her, from Russell Kirk, and from Alexis de Tocqueville, and show you the point they are driving at, and then hopefully I can sustain it with the Judeo-Christian worldview. But here's what she says in the beginning. In the usual litany of traits associated with the Enlightenment, reason, rights, nature, liberty, equality, tolerance, science, and progress. These are the terms that come. Reason invariably heads the list. What is conspicuously absent is the term virtue. Yet it was virtue rather than reason that took precedence for the British, not personal virtue, but social virtues, compassion, benevolence, sympathy, which the British philosophers believed naturally, instinctively, habitually bound people to each other. They did not deny reason. They were by no means irrationalists, but they gave reason a secondary, instrumental role rather than the primary, determinant one that the philosophers gave it. For the French, the rebellion was against the Papist Church and an authoritarian monarchy. Theirs was a reformation against religion. It was a fight for sheer reason. It was in the name of reason that Voltaire declared his war against the church, and that Diderot proposed, quote, to strangle the last king with the entrails of the last priest. But then she goes on. The driving force of the British Enlightenment was not reason, but social virtues or social affections. In America, it was also different, and the driving force was political liberty. But both in England and in America, for both of them, religion was not seen as the enemy. Rather, religion was interwoven into the culture. This is a key point. For the French, the authoritarianism of the Papist Church and the sort of the bullying that came from their monarchic history and so on, both of them were thrown off. What was it? Dickens said something, splendor rode hard on the bony shoulders of squalor as they tightened the screws and tightened the screws and tightened the screws. When the lid was thrown open, both the church and the monarchy were just sort of tossed away from their thinking, and reason became supreme. The philosophers, that was key to them. But now she goes on to quote Tocqueville in the early years of America's founding. I think there's some brilliant comments he makes that I want to bring to your attention. Europeans exaggerate the influence of geography on the lasting powers of democratic institutions. Too much importance is attached to laws and too little to mores. Unquestionably, these are the three great influences which regulate and direct American democracy. But if they are to be classed in order, here's what Tocqueville is saying. I should say that the contribution of physical causes is less than that of the laws, and that of the laws less than mores. The importance of mores is a universal truth to which study and experience continuously bring us back. I find it occupies the central position now in my thoughts. All my ideas come back to it in the end. For the Americans, the ideas of Christianity and liberty are so completely mingled that it is almost impossible to get them to conceive of one without the other. It is not a question with Americans of sterile beliefs bequeathed by the past and vegetating. Rather, it is the living within them in the very depths of their soul. The irony is, this is a Frenchman, along with one other Frenchman, Professor Halevi, who wrote on the fact that for the American mind, religion was inextricably bound with their laws. And so when he's talking about mores, he's talking about exactly what Oz was talking about, the habits of the heart and the moral framework. But today, this loss of the absolute is so pronounced, and the ushering of relativism and the trumpeting of an anti-absolutist position is a given in our academy. So the overthrow of the past, the cultural revolution, what it is actually doing is breaking us away from shared meanings of the past. You must have shared meanings of the past. And the shared meanings of the past involved, as Tocqueville has reminded us, in this conjoining of freedom with religion. Listen to what he says further. Freedom sees in religion the companion of its struggles and its triumphs, the cradle of its infancy, the divine source of its rights. It considers religion as the safeguard of mores, and mores as the guarantee of laws and the pledge of its own duration. At the same time that the law permits the American people to do everything, religion prevents them from conceiving everything and forbids them to dare everything. Despotism can do without faith, but freedom cannot. How could society fail to perish if, while the political bond is relaxed, the moral bond were not also tightened? And what makes a people master of itself if it has not submitted to God? Finally, he says this, I do not know if all Americans have faith in their religion, for who can read the bottom of their hearts? But I'm sure that they believe it necessary to the maintenance of Republican institutions. This opinion does not belong only to one class of citizens or to one party, but to the entire nation. One finds it in all ranks. This is an amazing set of ideas that he's put together for us. Now, I want to draw just two conclusions before moving to how I think this can only theoretically be sustained. It is this. The two conclusions I draw is that if morality is at the heart of what you and I must believe, then truth and meaning become the result of that, and truth and meaning bring that into focus. You see, for a nation like Russia, where God was evicted and the last act of Stalin was a clenched fist towards the heavens, it is fascinating how little truth actually matters to them. You may remember years ago in that tragic downing of the Korean airliner 007. I remember the very number of that flight because my wife herself had taken that same flight many times. And as that plane had supposedly strayed into other space that it wasn't supposed to be at, the Russians sent in their fighters and blew it out of midair. And all the Korean families waiting for their loved ones to come were waiting at the airport, stunned and shocked to find out that a nation like Russia, rather than commandeering the plane and bringing it down if they had suspicion, just blew it out of midair. I'll never forget the conversation between William Safire and Vladimir Posner of Pravda, what happened after that. And in this live discussion that's going on, Posner looks at Safire and says, Mr. Safire, you know very well what was going on there because their lights were not on. Safire says, that is not correct. The lights of the aircraft were ordered to be turned on, and they were on. Posner says, no, they were not. And finally, Sapphire says to him, just before the trigger was pulled, did you not have one of your pilots commenting that the lights were on? And he says, but he meant the other Russian pilot on the other side of the KAL flight. His lights were on. Sapphire says, Mr. Posner, may I read to you from the script? It said this, target's lights are on. Vladimir Posner was a reporter for Pravda, which means truth. The two leading newspapers is Vestia, which means news, and Pravda, which means truth. Many Russian friends have said to me, there's no Izvestia in Pravda, and there's no Pravda in Izvestia. There's no news in the truth, and there's no truth in the news. 40 years ago, Russell Kirk, Roots of American Order, traces America's founding actually to 4 cities. He goes through them: Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, and London. He describes what exactly that meant, and he bemoaned the fact that Jerusalem's bequest was the moral law, moral reasoning, the very person of God. And he said, Rome still exists in America, Athens still exists, London still does, but Jerusalem is gradually being expelled, and the moral law is no longer there. And so I just say this to you in bringing this to a conclusion. What did the moral law serve in the founding of this nation, as it did even in the Old Testament scriptures? When you go back to the beginning of time, there was only one law. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Very clear prescription. What did it mean? Don't play God. Don't become the definers of good and evil. Very simple. Don't play God, because on the day you do it, you're going to die. Satan twisted the whole thing and said, look, the reason he's told you not to do this is because when you eat of it, you will be as God, knowing good and evil. That's exactly what's happened in our nation today. Every one of us is playing God and denying that a transcendent, moral, infinite, uncaused being actually exists. We have deified ourselves in the process. That's precisely what has happened. Eating of the tree. You know, when you look at the healthcare law, one of those marvelous laws which was read after it was passed. And in that law, thousands of pages. Why is it we need so many laws to govern us? Because we violated that one law. Every law now dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. And so the moral law of God was just one prohibition. The second stage of it was Abraham, the man of the tent and the man of the altar. That was the law by which he lived, the law of faith. That this world is a world in which we are pilgrims. There's a transitoriness to this. But wherever he went, he built an altar because life at its core was sacred. Lot did not do that. And so from the moral law, we moved to Abraham's example, the man of the tent and the man of the altar. And then we come to the third stage. This is critical, the Decalogue. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. What preceded that? I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall have no other gods before me. The primary condition to which you and I are called is the condition of salvation and redemption. We cannot be a righteous nation until we are a redeemed nation. The salvific process was indispensable to the Decalogue. The moral law came after the heart could recognize that it needed to be transformed. The transformation of the human heart leads then to righteousness and ultimately to worship. That is the logical and the chronological sequence of redemption, righteousness, and worship. And so I say this to you. Why is that redemption necessary? Because first, there was a deep description of sin. Nobody likes to hear this anymore. So I say, all right, let's call it violation of purpose. So a 21-year-old man walks into a room and kills people 2 to 3 times his age and sits there for an hour watching them. And I say to myself, what is going on in the mind of this young man? Beholding people who came to pray, to read God's word, who knows at their stage in life what struggles and pains were already etched into their consciousness, and now to be gunned down by a man like this. Oz often says in our discussion that catastrophic evil like this forces us to define the very term what we mean by evil. The first line ever published in North America, the first line ever printed in the New England Primer said this: "In Adam's fall, we sinned all." That was the first line. And Muggeridge used to say the depravity of man is at once the most intellectually resisted fact at the same time that it is the most empirically verifiable. It's a fact. Number two, the condition. From number one, the condition. Number two, the answer. There is no other worldview. There is no other worldview that takes you to a hill called Calvary, and on the 2 pieces of timber where a Savior is dying for his creation, the Savior. And what is happening there is grace and truth are centerpiece as revealed to us, the grace of God in his forgiveness and the truth of God, that sin is a destructive thing and you and I desperately need a Savior. Ladies and gentlemen, here's what I want to say to you. Watch discourse today. And we face this. Some of the hostile letters we get and the angry letters. Sometimes I put them down on my desk and I say, who is this person? Why is there so much hate in this heart? Where is the grace? Where is the courtesy? Where is the kindness? Grace has gone. It is ironic that in the early 1800s, Alexander Dumas and Victor Hugo were penning 2 books. Dumas wrote the book on the Count of Monte Cristo and Victor Hugo on Les Miserables. And the entire narrative in Les Mis, and Hugo was unpopular for that book in the beginning because he had a bishop playing the part of extending grace to a criminal. The story of grace, the story of courtesy. Why can't we disagree today without being so disagreeable? Why do we have to mount such bitterness, such language that cuts people down? Why can't we sit down across tables and talk it? To me, the cross not only gives me the story of grace, but it asks me to extend grace even to people who disagree. And lastly is the centerpiece of all of this, life beyond the grave. You know, John Locke, with all of his skepticism, when Locke was penning down what are the 5 most guiding things in his life, he began with the need for being healthy. And he went on to talk of law and so on. But the final climactic thought in John Locke's writing was this: he believed in an afterlife. He said, otherwise this life doesn't make any sense for me. And so you take the gospel story, you take the place of the law, and you put this all together and say true freedom cannot exist unless it is rooted in morality. Morality cannot exist unless it is based on transcendent truth. And the transcendent truth of the Judeo-Christian worldview, even Gertrude Himmelfarb mentions that, as does Russell Kirk, gives a whole chapter on the beauty and the glories of the Christian message. I close with one simple illustration, and that is this. Just this week, the founder of Freedom from Religion Foundation, Anne Nicole Gaylor, passed away at the age of 88. And, you know, she did what she wanted to do. And there's a list of all of her accomplishments, some of them quite astounding. And she asked her daughter not to have a memorial service of any kind, and also that she had no hope in the future life. She quoted Bertrand Russell, "My body is going to rot once I'm done away with." But then she added this qualifier: that's what makes life precious. Wow. Not true. Not true. Her life proved that all life was not precious to her. What she really meant was time was precious, or her life was precious. Unless we recognize the intrinsic worth of every life, we cannot make the statement that life is actually precious. Life is precious because it is the gift of God, and life does not end with these 80 years and 10. Augustine lay dying in his 70s. People were coming to his bedside to have him pray for them. 2 great books by Augustine, Confessions and The City of God. He brought his own soul for cleansing, and the city of God that he looked forward to, whose builder was God himself. If we look to an eternal city, and if we want to build our cities with truth, liberty, and righteousness, we will need the transcendent perspective of what the law can do and what the law cannot do. What the heart needs desperately is regeneration, and the hope beyond the grave ultimately brings complete justice as well. Liberty is a precious gift because life is precious, given to us by God himself. Those are my thoughts for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Oz. And we're going to move now to a time of some Q&A. We'll take some questions. Just a word of apology in advance. We can obviously only get through a few, and we will try to do that. There will be a microphone in the center where you can come down and ask your question there. And we do ask that if you do come and ask a question, please, no speeches, no long 3-point sermons. And please don't ask Ravi or Oz tonight, are we absolutely free or are we predestined? That is not on the agenda tonight. Although I did say to Oz at the beginning, the two of you have been traveling the world so long, I know you've got this figured out, and everybody would like to know, but we won't go there tonight. So please, pass on that one. If you would, keep it relevant to this topic so that we can have just some questions on this. We do want to think about freedom. And maybe if you just come and line up while we're doing that, I'm going to ask a question of our both gentlemen tonight, just to begin us off. So if you get a question and you want to come down and line up, we can maximize the time. But Oz and Ravi, in both your respective ways, when we think of people coming with sense of hope, they look at times, changing times in culture. We've all seen the world change rapidly around us, but we also know from history, what should we actually be doing? I mean, many people, we get the ideas at times we see around us. We think of Germany during the Bonhoeffer years. We think of Christians living under communism, even things today where life seems constrained. What would you say to us, or what would you like to say practically that people could go out of here today in their churches or in their individual lives? What should they practically be doing to make a difference into today's kind of climate and bring as agents of hope in a sense? Oz, I don't know if you want to take the first shot and then give Ravi a second to let us.
Is it possible to turn up the lights? I'd love to see the audience.
We are being asked if we can turn up the lights so we can see the audience a little bit. There we go.
One of the questions I get asked a lot is, how on earth could the German Christians have caved in to National Socialism? And if you've ever looked at that period, the answer is actually very simple. If you understand the temper of the times, you can see the roots of cowardice, why they caved in. And if you look at much of the Christian church in America today, you have a similar temptation to cowardice. And I would say, Stuart, this is a time like Athanasius, Contra Mundum against the world, where he was exiled 5 times by the emperor, but kept coming back, standing for the faith, or Bonhoeffer, the Barmen Declaration. This is a time for Christians with convictions. They know who they believe, they know what they believe, why they believe, but they have courage. And we've got to practice the way of Jesus with gentleness, compassion, grace, but courage. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Ravi?
And I say this to you, Oz feels that very, very deeply. We've talked a lot about this. And he keeps coming back to this. It's really, this is the Bonhoeffer moment for the church. It's the moment where our sacred beliefs are being threatened in so many different ways. I think he's absolutely right. We have to have the courage and the courtesy to engage. I would say, just to push that a little further, in our families and in our homes, it is vitally important we engage our children on issues like this, because they just are at a loss. They don't know how to deal with this. And that's just not the young ones, even our children who are in universities. They just don't know how to engage the opposition or engage the intelligentsia of their time. What do we say? How do we respond? I had a student from the University of Toronto who was in his PhD program who phoned me one day, and he said the professor began his course by saying, "My goal in this course is to knock God out of you. As I'm laying it before you, it's to knock God out of you. If you don't like listening to this, you don't have to attend, and I will be glad to sort of give you a passing grade or give you some other assignment, but I really think so seriously about what I want to talk about here that this is precisely the goal that I have in mind." The student phones me and he says, "What am I going to do with this?" I thought, really? I mean, I lived in Toronto for many years. My wife's from there. My wife's Canadian. And I thought, my goodness, in a city like that, a historic university like that, that's the goal. How do we raise our children? How do we talk to them? How do we engage them to show them what the challenges are, how to graciously counter this? And it's not always just giving answers, it's asking questions as well. And we as a team go into some of the most hostile settings there are. And I find it very ironic. At the oldest Islamic university, I think, in Malaysia, where there were mullahs and all seated, it was a very, very fearsome environment in which for me to speak about the defense of the Christian faith. They were kinder and more courteous in giving me a hearing there. Sometimes in the West, that is not always being accorded. I'm just shocked at the changing ways in which people are responding. And now even just recently in Romania, speaking to members of the Senate, and just about 2 weeks ago when I was there, he said, "This is the first time God has been mentioned in these chambers. This is the first time prayer has been prayed in these chambers." Many political leaders came up and spoke and said, "We want you guys to come back. We want you to come back and minister to us." Those who evicted God find out the cost of what it meant for their cultures. We've had the presence and the freedom of this, and now we are evicting him, and we are not thinking of the consequences of what all of this means. So standing on the shoulders of what Oz is saying here, courage for this hour, and I'll say carry it into your families to teach them what the Christian faith is all about, why it is coherent, and how to answer the questions that they're being challenged with.
Thank you, Ravi. All right, young man, it looks like you're the first person at the microphone. Please go ahead.
First, thank you both for blessing us this evening and coming and speaking with us. Thank you for coming tonight and blessing us with your words and wisdom that you have for us. And looking out onto this crowd of young people, I would like for you to give us some type of idea, if you were my age or younger, in our shoes, how would you take the information that we received tonight and take it to our smaller communities and make impacts there? Like for me, I come from a place called Murfreesboro, about 22,000, 25,000 college kids in a very small area. And so how do we take the idea of freedom and what is freedom and change maybe the mentality they have or try to share that with them? I just want to know what Oz or Ravi would do if you were my age and had this information. Thank you.
First, I would break with the notion of generationalism. It's one of the problems of the younger generation. It's a generational thing you wouldn't understand. You know. No. But there's something very profound by it. It's the new relativism. It's the new mistrust of authority. It's the new corrosion of tradition. We've got to get that generation to really pass on the faith. And actually what we want to pass on is the same old thing. People need to know the Lord. They need to have deep theology. They need to have a thought-through Christian worldview. They need to have a sense of individual calling. They need to have brothers and sisters who'll stand around them for a lifetime, not networking, but a real fellowship group to hold them accountable. And these are actually the same things every generation needs. And then you have to identify the problems of this generation: the abandonment of evangelism for social justice, the rise of a cynicism rather than a confidence in the gospel. There are all sorts of obvious things. Analyze the generation, break with the worst of it, and teach again and pass on the simple things of the faith, like Paul did to Timothy, and so on. I don't think it's actually rocket science.
Two footnotes to that, too. The means through which young people engage today is sometimes very different out here. I'm a reader. I'm not a viewer or a watcher. I hardly watch anything. I just read. There's a good T-shirt I saw in Thailand. I don't even know if he understood what it meant, but this guy was walking on the street and it said at the back, "Don't judge a book by its movie." And I think it's very important to be able to find the means through which you gain their attention. Hollywood is very sharp in this. They know how to propagandize and how to impart ideas in the subtle form of a story. The existentialists were brilliant in this, in the way they wrote plays and the way they wrote stories. So maybe in your group it'll be great to find the kind of narrative in a story form and then open it up for discussion. It will get much more anchored within their own thinking. I think for the young who prefer to go through the eye gate, that would certainly be one way in which you can have that impartation to them. The second thing I would say is in dealing with the young is the more you ask questions, the more you open them up within their own assumptions. And it is the assumptions oftentimes that are flawed. And I think those assumptions are the ones that you can interact on, but it has to be one drop at a time. It doesn't really come wholesale. I know as a family man that it is easier for me to talk. It was easier for me to talk to my son while we were watching a baseball game, when everything we talked about seemed incidental to what was going on out there, and it was easier for him to absorb that than in a purely didactic setting, saying, "Now I want you to listen to me. Here's what I want to say about such and such." If you find the setting in which there's a greater degree of being disarmed, they are more likely to listen and apply that. These are just some practical clues, but first and most importantly, I want to commend you for having that desire to try carry that on and find that contagious spirit. That is what we have for the hope of the future. Well, one other thing I was just going to say, and that is triggered with what Oz was saying here. When I travel overseas, I find young people are really taken up by social causes of justice and need and so on. And when you take them into those settings to see the world of need, then point out that oftentimes the exploitation of those people at the hands of very corrupt hearts. So the heart has to change somewhere along the way. That's what Matthew Paris said in his own article, that all of these NGOs, Matthew Paris is an atheist. He says, and I'm challenging my own assumptions, he says the change of heart seems to be indispensable if benevolence and charity is going to make a difference in people's lives. Take them into practical settings, appeal to that sense which they already have, justice, mercy, compassion, and show how the change of heart is needed. These are just some practical ways in which you can work it into their thinking.
I think, do you have a comeback? Oh, we're on a roll here. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. One PS. Since you're all here probably very interested in apologetics, I would just add a passion of mine. We need to understand the modern world not only in terms of ideas. Apologists are great on philosophies and ideas. They're not so good on the impact of modernity. In other words, everything produced by the Industrial Revolution, right down. Ravi, you said you're a reader, but you have a BlackBerry. And all the studies show that everyone lives 50% of a day before the triple screen, as it's called, the television, the laptop, or the smart device. And the impact on our thinking is very, very profound, as you know. And we're supposed to discern, test the spirits. We need to have a much greater understanding of modernity, not just modernism and postmodernism. We need to go beyond ideas to see how we're being shaped.
So be transformed by the removal of our minds. He's not sure on that one. That's okay. Go ahead, young man.
Gentlemen, as our culture feels the tension between desire for freedom and desire for security, how can we best articulate the need for freedom of conscience?
That is currently the burning issue. If you just think in 20 years, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the early 90s passed with only 3 people in the Senate and the House, hundreds of people, only 3 dissenters, universal approval. Now, a total fracturing of the understanding of religious freedom and freedom of conscience. Why? Because of the LGBT revolution and the way they're playing what they call a zero-sum game, so that anything that contradicts their freedom should be overruled. The tragedy with that is these are former liberals who are now highly illiberal, because if one human right, the new fashionable one, overrides the accepted traditional understanding of a deep human right, conscience and religious freedom, what you're saying is that rights are only a matter of power. And you're in a kind of Nietzschean power game that is destructive of all human rights. And it's just another example how many of our secularist friends can no longer give a foundation for human dignity. And now increasingly they can't give a foundation for freedom. And many of their ways of stressing it are undermining freedom. So it's not a matter of defending ourselves. We want to defend a right that is precious for all human beings. And if you go back to the history of religious freedom, the first mention was by a Christian, Tertullian, who argues that worship of God must be uncoerced and free. And you can see that running down the centuries, sadly contradicted by the Catholic centuries. But when it was rediscovered in the 17th century, Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island and so on, that was the point of it. This is a precious human right. Of course, we may face persecution and death, like our brothers and sisters under the Islamic State. So freedom of conscience is not on the level of the gospel. We are faithful to the gospel, but it is a precious right that gives us and everyone a freedom, and it's in danger this very year. And anyone who followed the Indiana case knows the very troubling responses to this issue.
So be active, be involved, be...
Well, we've all got our limited areas, but wherever you are, understand the issue and be a persuader in public in the circles that you move. All right. And above all, when we come to the national level, pray.
Amen. Young man, you're ready to go.
This question may be a bit off topic, but I'm wondering something. As you know, religion is a really touchy subject this modern day. So if you have your modern day politician, a pastor's going to ask him, what would you say on the subject of a new church, say, downtown? And then he goes, build your church, I want your votes. He's thinking the I want your votes thing, but... And then an atheist starts glaring at him, and then he quickly adds, but don't overdo it. So how do you think they manage to balance out the beliefs of Christians and other people who believe in God and atheists? How do you think they manage to do it and still manage to get elected?
Did you get the...
I may have done it slightly wrong.
Yeah. Essentially, the young man is asking about the freedom to believe and not to believe, and someone gets elected giving maybe favors to a church, but then how do we balance these conflicting voices? It's back to the religious liberty question of the person who doesn't believe aggressively and the person who doesn't. Is politics just a sort of a neutral art of throwing dogs to a bone?
Great question. Very, very quickly.
Or bones to a dog even?
What?
Sorry.
Very, very quickly. Worldwide, we've got 2 massive problems: state oppression and sectarian violence. Now, in countries like the United States, where they had a pretty good system until recently, you can see two competing visions that I think are becoming extreme. One is those who argue for a sacred public square. In this country, it's many people who want to impose Christian things everywhere, like school prayer. You have California schools with 90 religions in one school. What on earth does Christian school prayer have in that sort of situation? But you've got proponents of the so-called sacred public square, and then on the other side, this is what you're referring to, proponents of the so-called naked public square who are driving the whole business out. And what they're doing is closing the public square and undermining freedom yet again. And we should be fighters for people, in quotes, we should be proponents of a civil public square where everyone, based on freedom of conscience, has their religious freedom. Not just us. I remember a Jewish journalist said to me in the 1980s, I know about evangelicals, he said, they talk justice, but what they really mean is just us. And we've got to be seen to be fighting for the common good, everyone's freedom to enter the public square. And that's a huge issue. That's a tiny, brief answer.
Which is the very thing we're battling with in the country at the present, right? The idea of what is the common good and can we find a shared future together? Ravi, did you have anything to add on that?
Well, I think one of the things that, at least up till this point, in these countries, there was the freedom to believe or to disbelieve. Where's the young man? Are you homeschooled? No, sir. No. Boy, you sure sound like one. You're very, very, very articulate. Yeah. You're so articulate in that. I remember being in one major country. I go to so many countries, so I won't name it. And I was sitting with their minister of religion across the aisle from me. And he was asking me why I was coming there. And I said, yeah, I was being invited by the universities, and they were of that faith, predominant faith, and 80 to 90% of them were of that worldview. He said, oh, are you coming there? I said, yeah. And so we started talking. And then he made the fact, he said, well, how much will you be discussing your own belief and so on and so forth. I could see he was getting a bit nervous about this. I said, can I ask you something? You talk about the freedom that you do have in your country. Do you really have the freedom to disbelieve as well? That sort of stumped him, pardon the cricketing term, but that's like being picked off on first base type thing. He didn't quite make it to the base. He was stumped for a moment. They really are not given the freedom to disbelieve. They are compelled. And so sometimes in some worldviews, for example, people will say Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, and I've spoken in many of their countries. It's not true. It's the fastest growing enforced religion in the world, because in many of their countries, they are not given permission to disbelieve. It's changing quite rapidly in some of these countries because they are fed up. Some of the young people are fed up of what they are seeing happening by the extremism within their worldview. So I say we should be able to have a situation in which you're free to believe and or disbelieve, and in the dialogue establish which position is true and why. We were given this privilege for a long time, but now you're really anathematized if you believe. You're put into a margin. You're said, you're really not in the inner circle. Disbelief and unbelief is more popular now than for somebody to say, I have a genuine faith in God. It is interesting, even though Jefferson had so many conflicting views on this matter, when he was seen going to church with his prayer book in his hand, somebody looked at him and said, Mr. J said, you don't really believe all of this. Why are you going there? And he said, as the chief magistrate in this country, I have to set the example, because without a moral basis for our law, our country will not survive. That was answer. And George Washington's farewell speech, that religion was indispensable to morality. So we ought to be given the freedom to believe and those freedom to disbelieve. And in cordiality, we can have our differences. This country was unique in that it is gradually looking at an equation where those who believe are considered on the wrong end of the stick now.
Thank you, Ravi. We've got time. Well, we're getting down to the wire, and we'll get one last question. We can maybe add that as a final word. I'll give you a closing word each. Please take this. This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid. Sorry, but go ahead, sir.
Well, then it better be a good one, I guess.
Well, that's all right. We have gold stars at the end
Should
of the
we
night.
revoke Donald Trump's freedom to run for president? I'm just kidding. My question is, and this sort of ties with both Oz Guinness, your politics understanding with liberty, rights, and then Ravi, your understanding of philosophy. I was once taught that freedom is innate in human nature, but is this possible outside the realm of metaphysics in the image of God complex?
Please say that last line again. Is it possible outside of the realm
Is
of
it outside the possible of metaphysics in the image of God complex?
Very quickly, no. That's why I was saying the worldviews at the end. Read Sam Harris, freedom is an illusion within its naturalistic framework. As I say, the Eastern understanding of freedom is very, very different. And the biblical idea is that made in the image of God, freedom is a gift. As I say, the Lord is the only purely free one. He does what he wills perfectly. We don't. When we do what we will, we're fallen, sometimes good, sometimes evil. But gift, as I said, is that gift of God through which we most resemble our Creator. That's why it's precious. So the answer is no.
Ravi, did you want to add, or? Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we wind up, I'd just like to say, gentlemen, would you like a closing statement? Yes, and I was going to give that to you, so please go ahead.
I just had one thing to the previous question. Again, I'm involved in 2 projects now on religious freedom, freedom of conscience in Washington. There are lots of good things being suggested in the country. The missing factor every time is leadership. You've got political leaders, no statesmen. And we need to pray that God will raise up a leader. When my book on Free People's Suicide came out, I was invited to the Congress by a veteran who had been there 30 years. He said, I really like your book, but the reason I'm not as hopeful as you are is there are no leaders, and having been here 30 years, all you have is partisan bickering. There is no leadership. There's no Lincoln. There's no FDR. There's no Winston Churchill. We should pray the Lord will raise up a leader. Amen.
I think, to my way of thinking, this tragedy is so far global right now, even in the world. You know, Oz, you and I travel so much. And I remember being in Amman, Jordan, and I had just come from Damascus, Syria. Some of you may have heard me tell this story. My colleagues have. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. I was every time I arrived in Damascus, they would invite me to the chief of intelligence's office. He'd be flanked by all the generals, and for what it was worth, they'd have some baklava in the front to give you the sweet. It was a very intimidating situation. Nobody ate. We were always just being questioned. And he would look at me always and then say, Mr. Zacharias, he said, thank you for coming here. Don't get involved in the politics of the region. And he'd give me a very stern look. And I said to him, you know me, sir? I don't. He said, yes, and you are very welcome here. I said, I have a question for you. What do you think is happening in this part of the world, or what do you think this part of the world looks like? This was before any of the turmoil had begun with ISIS and Mubarak and Gaddafi and the others and so on. All that overthrow had before that. He looked at me and he said, I give this part of the world no more than 5 years and the whole place is going to blow up. I said, you mean that? He said, yes. And that's all he said. I went straight from there to Amman. I don't know, Stuart was with us. There was a group of us in the car, my wife, 3 or 4 others. We got off and we were called into the palace. We were not properly dressed, but they said this is the only time they wanted us to come there. I thought we were in trouble. So we went. And Prince Raad, who was the cousin to King Hussein of Jordan and the last heir to the throne in Iraq in the royal family, he was entertaining us. And I looked at him and I said, Your Excellency, what is the greatest need in our world today? I was just trying to make conversation, actually. And he looked at me and said, youth and leadership. He said, our young are looking for models of leadership, and they're not seeing it anywhere at all. We need leaders that our young people can draw examples from. One of the first people to be assassinated was the chief of intelligence in Damascus. He was wiped out when ISIS stormed in there. That era has gone now. And I think of what Prince Raj said. So since Oz talked about leadership, let me talk a little bit about the youth. The world of temptation is around you to trip you up. It'll assault your imagination in every possible way till half of your life you will be spending in a rescue operation trying to salvage what it is you have lost. And so I say to you, draw the lines in the right places soon and don't cross them. As tough as it is, pleasure always comes at a cost. For the right kind of pleasure, you pay the price before you enter into it. For the wrong kind of pleasure, you pay the price after you have enjoyed it. So I say to the youth, especially to the young, and looking at that young man, so grateful that he is here. Our young men and our young women are under assault from the media, intentionally or otherwise. If you're a young man or a young woman, draw the lines in the right places so that your life can be spent in a proper investment, not trying to recover what has been lost in the years gone by. Between youth and leadership, I think we have God bless you.
Well, thank you to both our speakers, Dr. Guinness and Dr. Zacharias, and thank you for coming. There will be a book signing in a few minutes at the back if you want to get some literature, and we'll try and get some of the books signed. Again, if you have a form to fill out so we can stay in touch with you or send you further information. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, and pray for the country, pray for our future, and good night to you. Thank you.